Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's Opera Lovers Lecture. So happy to have you with us. And I'm especially happy to be welcoming Matthew Aucoin. Matthew is a composer, a conductor, and a writer. He is the co-founder of the American Modern Opera Project. His operas have been performed and produced at places like the Metropolitan Opera, Los Angeles Opera, Brooklyn Academy of Music. And his orchestral works have been played by many of the finest orchestras in the world. But perhaps most important to today's talk, Matthew's book, The Impossible Art: Adventures in Opera, was published in 2021, and it has a good chunk of it dedicated to the Rakes progress. So I feel really fortunate to have him with us today to talk to us a little bit about his perspective on this piece, what he loves about it, and where he thinks it sits within the canon of this impossible art of opera. So thanks for joining us, Matthew.
Thanks for having me, Taylor. I'm glad to be with you all, and hello to everyone who's watching. I can't see you, but I can feel your presence. You are in for such a treat at Lakes Area Music Festival because the Rake's Progress is, I think, one of the ultimate gems of the art form of opera. It's a little bit like the opera that Mozart didn't live long enough to write. It's like the lost sibling or cousin to the great capital C classical era operas, and I think it's special in part because of the deeply personal, buried biographical information that the librettists W.H. Auden and Chester Kallman embedded in the piece. There are all kinds of secret messages and love notes and personal histories buried in the piece. And it's also extraordinary because of the musical language that Stravinsky found for this piece. I think, I want us to start off in a way thinking about masks and what it is in theater to put on a mask and what that enables and what that hides. Stravinsky was someone who is not always thought of as the warmest or cuddliest of composers. We might know his Rite of Spring, whether from the concert hall or from Fantasia. We might think of him as kind of the embodiment of 20th century modernism in its machine-like or industrial strength forms. But there is so much emotion and so much spiritual intensity to Stravinsky's music. The thing about him is that he always needed to wear a mask. He was always more comfortable expressing emotion. He wouldn't have liked to put it in those terms, but he was more comfortable uh, expressing himself in music while wearing a mask. And the thing about the Rake's Progress is that he puts on this outer mask or carapace of the classical era of the music of Mozart and Handel and Haydn. It's very familiarly the music of the 18th century, which for some people, when they first encounter the piece, they think, is he making fun of it? Is this a parody? Is it some kind of tribute? But my take on it is that style, that aesthetic, was a kind of protective covering that he had to put on so that he could be more emotionally vulnerable than in almost any other piece of music that he wrote in his entire life. So, to get started, some of you may know the opera's story already, but I don't want to assume that all of you do. So, just a quick refresher. At the beginning of the story, a young man named Tom Rakewell is in love with a young woman named Anne Truelove. It's a little bit on the nose, their names. Tom's, an attractive enough but quite lazy young man living in the country. with Anne and her father. And one day he speaks aloud that he just really wishes he were rich. And no sooner does he do that than the mysterious Nick Shadow appears and announces that Tom has inherited a vast fortune from an uncle of whom Tom was not previously aware. He didn't know he had an uncle. But he has to go off to London now to inherit his wealth. Nick Shadow agrees to serve Tom for a year and a day, at which point he will collect whatever wages they decide are fair. Tom goes to London. He immediately gives in to every kind of desire. He goes to brothels, he gambles, he loses this fortune that he has just inherited. He forgets all about Anne. And as he finds himself driven to deeper and deeper despair, he decides to undertake an action to kill desire, to prove that he's free of all of these desires that have consumed him by marrying someone that he's not attracted to. He thinks that in a kind of fit of insanity that the only way to be free is to do the last thing that he wants to do. So he marries Baba the Turk, who is a circus performer, a bearded lady in a local circus. I won't take you through every twist and turn of the plot, but eventually Nick Shadow does claim his wages, which are, of course, nothing less than Tom's soul. He has given away his soul, and Nick Shadow is, if not the devil, a close servant of the devil. Anne, true love, still loves Tom, and her love saves him from being damned all the way. But uh, in a kind of poignant piece of justice, he's driven insane. He's not damned, but he is robbed of his wits. And of course, he's kind of been insane uh, this whole time in a certain way. So the opera ends with a heartbreaking scene in an insane asylum in Bedlam when Anne goes to visit Tom. They have a reconciliation, and then Anne leaves, and Tom has forgotten everything. Um, it is actually quite a funny opera at many points along the way, even though I know the description of it may sound a little bit bleak. This piece is special in part because it's one of the very rare cases in which a truly great composer, Stravinsky, worked also with a truly great poet, W.H. Auden. And both of them, Stravinsky and Auden, had a habit in their previous collaborations of being quite bossy and condescending. Stravinsky, even when he worked with someone like Jean Cocteau, um, basically just told him that he didn't really care about the quality of the libretto. He wanted something, as he said, very banal. Just give me something that's very straightforward that I can set to music. Auden had worked with another great composer, Benjamin Britten, and he had totally bossed Britten around when they adapted, of all things, Paul Bunyan. You can think about two British expats who just arrived in New York, both of them kind of flamboyantly gay, setting this kind of story of an American manly man. It sounds like some kind of parody out of The Producers. Um, so that was Auden's previous experience in opera, and neither of them had ever found a collaborator whom they regarded as a genuine peer. And what's special about the Rake, in part, is that Stravinsky loves Auden's language, and Auden loves Stravinsky's music so profoundly that it's a real meeting of the minds. I want to talk a bit about Auden's background in opera and also the extraordinary personal history of this piece. Auden, in addition to being a great poet, was also kind of an amazing philosopher of music. He wrote a lot about opera as an art form, and he was notably kind of self-effacing about the job of the librettist. He says that when you write a text for an opera, you're not really writing it for the audience because the audience is not going to hear the words. Let's be real. The audience is just going to hear the music. Auden said that he didn't think people understood words so much as sung syllables. And so the way that he conceived of writing a libretto was that a libretto is like a private letter to the composer. He said, you know, the moment of glory for someone who writes an opera libretto is the moment when the composer encounters their verses in private, and the moment that it kind of sets something aflame and inspires a piece of music. He sort of regarded it as a sacrificial act. You know, your words are not going to be understood as words, but they're going to inspire this music. He was also very funny about the nature of opera as an art form. He said that basically uh, nothing should make sense in the conventional sense of sense because people do not sing when they're feeling rational. If you're going to say something rational, you're not going to sing about it. So in opera, the basic rule is that you cannot say one sensible thing. The things that you communicate in opera have to be curses and prayers and prophecies, and you have to reveal long buried traumas. You should not be talking about banal everyday things. You should not be talking about tax policy. You should not be talking about healthcare. And as Auden said very beautifully, it's hard to not write a single line that makes sense, but Wagner in particular managed to do that. So he was somebody who really had a deep appreciation of this art form and a kind of humble understanding of his own role in it. The extraordinary thing about the Rake in particular is that he didn't write the libretto himself. He wrote it together with his life partner, Chester Kallman, who was an American, a kind of frustrated writer, quite a bit younger than Auden, whom he met in 1939 in New York. And it was partly through his relationship with Kallman that Auden, well, on one hand, got to know opera a lot better, but more importantly, uh, believed that he could be loved and that he could be in a loving relationship. Auden uh, became famous very young and was kind of a philosopher poet, kind of a public figure in a way that it's hard to imagine any poet being today. And he didn't really give himself time or didn't have faith that he could be in a loving relationship. But soon after he met Kallman, his life really changed. And I'd love to just read a bit of a poem that Auden wrote the year after he and Kallman uh, began dating, which is a beautiful kind of vision of human connection, which to me is really suffused with this newfound sense of the possibilities of love. As I walked out one evening, walking down Bristol Street, the crowds upon the pavement were fields of harvest wheat, and down by the brimming river I heard a lover sing under an arch of the railway, "Love has no ending. I'll love you, dear, I'll love you till China and Africa meet, and the river jumps over the mountain, and the salmon sing in the street. I'll love you till the ocean is folded and hung up to dry, and the seven stars go squawking like geese about the sky. The years shall run like rabbits, for in my arms I hold the flower of the ages and the first love of the world." But all the clocks in the city began to whir and chime. Oh, let not time deceive you. You cannot conquer time. In the burrows of the nightmare, where justice naked is, time watches from the shadow and coughs when you would kiss. In headaches and in worry, vaguely life leaks away, and time will have his fancy tomorrow or today. Into many a green valley drifts the appalling snow. Time breaks the threaded dances and the diver's brilliant bow. Oh, plunge your hands in water, plunge them up to the wrist. Stare, stare in the basin and wonder what you've missed. The glacier knocks in the cupboard, the desert sighs in the bed, and the crack in the teacup opens a lane to the land of the dead. We don't have time to read the whole poem, but it does include the great line, you shall love your crooked neighbor with your crooked heart, which is, I think, one of the greatest articulations of the way that we have to care about each other with all of our flaws. So, anyway, Auden, in this newfound state of kind of connection and possibility, uh, lived with Auden for more than a decade before he began collaborating with Stravinsky. And by that time, their relationship had gotten a little bit more complicated. Chester Kallman uh, was not a big believer in monogamy. There were fidelity issues. He broke Auden's heart repeatedly. And the way that we might say it today is that Kallman suffered from bipolar disorder, what at the time was referred to as manic depression. And part of the reason that I think that the Rake's Progress was a good fit for this librettist pair is that Tom Rakewell himself, our protagonist, is a manic depressive. As Auden put it, he is someone who gets very, very excited about anything in the future and then immediately gets very depressed by anything in the present. He gets super excited about business prospects and plans, and it's going to be great, and we're going to be rich. And then the moment he has to take concrete action, the wind goes out of his sails. And so his life is this pattern of rushing forward into these illusory futures and then finding himself with nothing. So I'm sure you can imagine that the plot of the Rake's Progress, this story of a young man who loses everything and is only partially redeemed by love, who is saved in some sense, but who also uh, loses his mind, is a really scary portrait of the relationship of the people who were writing the piece. It's a sort of therapy. The fascinating thing too is that I'm not sure Stravinsky was aware of any of this. I'm not sure he was totally aware of what the relationship between Auden and Kallman was. And in fact, he thought that he was signing up for a libretto by W.H. Auden alone. And that when Auden said, by the way, my friend Chester is going to write it with me, Stravinsky was quite confused, if not disturbed. However, he felt quite a bit better as soon as he started seeing the quality of what Auden and Kallman were giving him. And now I want to move into the nature of the work itself, and in particular, what Stravinsky did to the text that Auden and Kallman delivered for him. We're getting to the point where there will be some musical examples which are much more beautiful to listen to than my voice is. Um, Auden and Kallman wanted, because this piece is set in 18th century London, to write in that style very strictly. So we're talking about verse forms that are rhyming, that have really strict meters, and that feel really like something that you would have heard in the period. And I want to think for a second about how we understand poetry in relation to music. For those of you who know vocal music, there's a general way of talking about text, which is very much about the text being kind of deferential to the music, or the music being kind of deferential to the text. Like, oh, look at, the text of this Schubert song is so modest, it just kind of makes way for the music. Or else, the this chord in a French Impressionist song just kind of illuminates the poetic image. Speaking as a composer, I think that the relationship between words and music is always a little bit more tense than that. There's always a little bit of a struggle going on. It's a little bit of a battle of wills. Because if the music followed the rules of the text, if the music just did what the text seemed to want to do, if it just kept the rhythms of the text as spoken, what would the point of the music be? You might as well just recite the poem. You might as well just look at it on the page. There always has to be some kind of activation or some kind of difference between what's happening in the poem and in the music. And I want to kind of start with a really familiar example, and I'm going to share my screen for a moment. This is probably like the most familiar example that I could give, which is Shakespeare's Sonnet 18. So, and Taylor can alert me if you can't see the text, but good. So we've got this text that probably everybody knows. And it's kind of the classic example of iambic pentameter. 5 beats to a line, alternating stresses. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? And this, you can ignore the right side of the screen and just look at the part that is labeled the bad version. If we were to actually keep that alternating stress syllable, ba 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 ba, we would end up with something like, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. And that obviously is super inorganic and awkward because it's stressing all kinds of syllables that are not really stressed. We would not stress the word to. We would not stress the last syllable of temperate. The reality is that in this poem, the rhythm is something much more fluid and much more like something that's skimming across the surface of a lake. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake. You know, it's not actually da-dum, 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 da-dum. And so when a composer looks at a text like this, they're looking at what the poetry seems to imply, as well as all the things that are unspoken and kind of buried inside the text. And now, here, ignore the left side of the screen and look, if you would, at this text of one of the arias from the Rakes' Progress, "Love Too Frequently Betrayed." And I'm going to use this as an example of um, what Stravinsky does to uh, the text as it looks on the page. This is a moment in the opera when Tom Rakewell has arrived in London. He's arrived at a brothel or a tavern. You know, there's drunken young men and prostitutes surrounding him, and Nick Shadow, who seems to kind of be the ringleader of this debauched bunch, gets everyone's attention and says, "Hey, everyone, I'd like you to meet someone new. I think you're going to like him because he's rich. His name is Tom Rakewell." And at a certain point in the party, he wants to initiate Tom into the club, so to speak. And he asks him a series of questions. What is pleasure? What is beauty? And then he asks him, what is love? And it seems like what he wants Tom to do is to renounce love. As Auden said, this is what Alberich does in the beginning of The Ring. He says, the hell with love. And it seems to be kind of a test. He wants Tom to say that love is an illusion. But instead, Tom, who's already had a couple of drinks too many and is really missing his girlfriend, sings this very, very sad ode to love. And the text, I'll read just the first stanza, has this rhythm: love too frequently betrayed for some plausible desire or the world's enchanted fire, still Thy traitor in his sleep renews the vow he did not keep. Weeping, weeping, he kneels before thy wounded shade. So, in poetic terms, the stresses are, as we would say, on the beat. Love too frequently betrayed for some plausible desire. So it's in 4/4, and the stresses are very much on the beat. Now, what I want to do now is look at what Stravinsky does to this same text. And for folks who don't read music, don't worry, we are about to also listen to it. Near the bottom of the first page, um, you might notice if you're able to squint and if you read music, that the first word, love, is on an offbeat. It's not what the poem does, where it's bum, ba, bum, ba, bum, ba, bum. It's an upbeat. And this continues throughout the text, that everywhere there's a strong emphasis in the poem, it's reversed in Stravinsky. Too frequently betrayed for some plausible desire. That for, which starts the second line of the poem, is also on an upbeat, not a downbeat. Still thy traitor in his sleep, the next line, uh, is the same thing. And so, what this does is that when we listen to the music, we hear two things at once. We hear what Stravinsky's done to it, which is to reverse all the stresses and reverse the meter. But we also hear the ghost of the original meter because we speak English. We remember what the meter is supposed to be. So we hear this kind of tension between what we would have expected it to be and what it actually is. And now I'm just going to actually redo a share with audio so that I can play a recording of this same. Oh, I already was sharing sound. Great. This is a recording of this aria sung by a friend of mine, Paul Appleby, from the Aix-en-Provence Festival. Because it was done in France, please forgive the fact the subtitles are in French. I'm assuming nobody needs that.
Mr. Tom Rakewell.
I'm sure some of you noticed that an artist very familiar to Lakes Area Music Festival, Julia Bullock, was Anne Truelove in the background in that excerpt. Um, so I hope that even though we weren't following along with the text, it was clear to everyone that a text that might have looked kind of blocky on the page, bump, 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 kind of melts and expands and becomes this super beautiful, legato, lyrical piece of music. And that, I want to open the floor to conversation with Taylor and all of you very soon. But I want to play one more musical excerpt and just and talk for a moment about the piece's music and its reception over the decades. Because the thing that I've always found a little bit hard to understand is that when the Rake's Progress had its premiere, the general consensus was that it was very cold and that it was very cold and very artificial. I dug up when I wrote about the piece in my book. I looked at a lot of initial reviews, not just at the first performance, but the first decade or so. And critic after critic uh, attacks Stravinsky for his artificiality, for the idea that the piece is some kind of cold intellectual conception, and that he's using these classical modes in a kind of heartless way. And this to me feels like a very, very mid 20th century reaction. It was a moment when you were either in this camp or that one. You were either an atonal composer or a tonal composer. And if you made the mistake of stepping from one camp into the other, you were going to get attacked. And Stravinsky had, in a way, committed the ultimate sin by being a kind of hardcore modernist, so to speak, and then starting to experiment with um, different modes. The thing that I love about Stravinsky is he always sounds like himself to me, no matter what mode he's in. I mean, even if he's writing totally radical 12-tone music, to me, it's the same spirit and the same energy and the same uh, playfulness. But this is the kind of thing that it takes decades and decades to appreciate. And I always think of something that the great pianist Robert Levin told me once. We were talking in that case about Mozart, and Levin pointed out that in Mozart's lifetime, he wasn't the biggest hit with audiences, and he wasn't the biggest hit with people who were in the position of critics, which often meant people in the government or royal bureaucracy at that time. It was musicians, it was performers who said, we have to perform this music. It's not someone outside of it, it's someone inside of the piece who has felt it in their bodies, who said, no, 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 Mozart is the guy that we have to keep, alive in the coming decades. And for me, the reason the Rake's Progress has survived is a similar reason. It's never been the biggest hit among audiences. It's never been the critical favorite. But if you talk to performers who've done it, it is the most nourishing uh, and rewarding piece. It grows on you when you spend weeks and weeks working on it. And I find that if a piece nourishes performers to that degree, it eventually reaches audiences and critics and whoever else too. And that's a very healthy way for a piece to develop, and that's why the piece has only gotten more popular over its 75 almost years of existence. Don't quote me on that, but 70 something. Anyway, Taylor, what do you want to talk about?
Oh my goodness, there's so much. Well, first, I think one really obvious question, because of your unique perspective. You talked a lot about what you appreciate about this piece and why you think it has stood the test of time so well. How has it affected your compositional process as you're somebody who writes a lot of opera? What is the techniques or the ethos that you bring from your love of this work to the things that you do?
That is such a great question. Um, well, first of all, a kind of fearlessness about emotional vulnerability. I really think that this is actually such an open-hearted piece. And there are moments in it where you just think, my God, uh, he really went there. And I think that's one thing. Um, Another is the relationship to the text that I mentioned, where you don't do the obvious thing, you don't follow the rhythms, you turn them upside down, and it just makes the whole thing kind of come alive. Also, I'm a big lover of vocal ensembles in opera. I think the most satisfying thing in the world is when you have four or five great soloists singing really lush things in an overlapping way, and there are such great ensembles in this piece. There's this totally delicious trio between Tom, Anne, and Baba. Um, so those are just a few things, but I could go on.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And I love the way that you talk about this libretto as Auden and Kalman writing this instead of being in therapy. With that in mind, do you see in this work any resolution to that question of their relationship in the moral of this story? Where do you think they get to in that therapizing, or do they get anywhere? Are they just sort of circling around these issues?
I think they really do get somewhere,
Mhm.
but it's not a simple conclusion. I think one of the most heartbreaking and honest things is the way that love only partially saves Tom. It's not the Wagnerian thing where it's like the woman sacrifices herself and so the man is saved.
Mhm.
It's not that kind of, I think, simplistic redemption. There's this really honest recognition that love can do some things but not others. Um, I think this is really, you could read this opera as being an opera about addiction, that Tom is addicted to gambling, that he has that kind of compulsive personality, and love cannot change that. There's a really honest recognition that love can't change a person's brain chemistry, but that love can um, maybe keep a person safe, keep them in a place where they're um, uh, comforted. There's a real comfort. So I think there's this beautiful um, there's kind of a double ending. There's the scene of reconciliation, then there's the scene where Tom forgets that the scene of reconciliation happened. And I
Mhm.
think for anyone who's loved someone who struggles with addiction or who struggles with this kind of mental health issue, that doubleness, I think, is probably a familiar feeling, that like you can reach the person and then they can always slip away again. Um, and the Auden Common saga is really fascinating. I believe Common passed away not that long after Auden, even though he was much younger, because he was alcoholic. He had a lot of health issues, and through a really bizarre fluke of history, Auden made Common the executor of his estate, but then Common passed away quickly, and so Auden's estate, the whole control of this literary empire, went to Chester Coleman's father, who was a dentist in Queens. And so there was a really strange moment where, like, this elderly dentist in Queens who had no particular interest in poetry had to figure out what to do with all of the works of W.H. Auden. So the saga, you know, ending up in Bedlam, ending up in this kind of absurd place, it's not far from the mark.
Yeah, and that is fascinating. But the talk about sort of addiction and obsession, that put me in mind of, I think, my favorite stanza in the entire opera that I just wanted to read here. It's Tom in, I believe it's Act 2, Scene 1, when he's sort of spent all of his pleasure, and it really speaks to that sort of addictive personality type. And it's so sad, but so beautiful. Always the quarry that I stalk fades or evades me, and I walk an endless hall of chandeliers in light that blinds, in light that sears, reflected from a million smiles, all empty as the country miles of silly wood and senseless park, and only in my heart the dark.
I mean, come on.
I just find that so devastating, but so beautiful every time. Um, yeah.
Yes. Brutal. And I mean, I think that's another thing about this piece is like it really does seem to wear this mask of the classical period. It's easy at first glance to think, oh yes, this is charming. But for me, that makes it all the more brutal when the mask falls off at the end. And only in my heart the dark, that's the there are these glittering chandeliers, which also, there are glittering chandeliers in the music too. There are these sparkling ornamented forms. And then it's really heart-wrenching. There's a moment at the end when Tom is being mourned by the other inmates, and it's like the clock gets turned back in musical history, and we're not in the 18th century anymore. We're at like the beginning of the 17th century. It's almost like something out of Monteverdi, when they sing this very, very simple lament with sustained trumpets, and you really do feel like everything has fallen away. All the illusions, those halls, they've all disappeared, and we're somewhere very, very interior.
Yeah. That puts me in mind of something that I think about a lot in this piece, and more broadly in what we call Stravinsky's neoclassical period, is that it's not like we think of the classical period as a very distinct time in music history, encompassing Haydn, Mozart, early Beethoven, things like that. And really, what I hear in this piece, especially, is that it's sort of neo everything before modernism.
Uh-huh.
Know if you agree, like, but you hear the counterpoint of pre-Baroque music sometimes. You hear a lot of Monteverdi. I'm thinking of the fanfare at the beginning, and you just mentioned that final chorus. You hear Mozart, and then sometimes you do get some sort of 19th century bel canto moments, at least in my hearing. Um, do you think that the term neoclassicism covers it, or how would you
Mm.
describe the kind of pastiche of musical styles that Stravinsky is working with in his palette?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, we've barely talked about Baba the Turk, probably the most uh, delightful character in the whole piece, but this bearded lady, um,
And
uh,
the most self-aware.
totally self-aware. She's such a dear. She's over it. She's been a circus performer for decades, and I think it's a lot of Baba's music that has the 19th century in it. These kind of fabulous, campy, like her when she says that she is gonna return to the stage. Um, there is bel canto there. Yeah, I guess when you write an opera, I can say from experience that if you if you set yourself narrow rules of like I'm going to write in this exact idiom, you're not going to get very far. Like an opera is a whole world.
Yeah.
You're building an entire universe, and you need so many tools in your toolkit. And even if you think you're going to abide by certain harmonic rules or whatever, you think you're going to use this rhythmic pattern a lot or whatever, you are inevitably going to be surprised by the experience of actually writing the piece. And so you do need to be willing to throw everything in the kitchen sink in. There's something that I highlight in my book, which I find fascinating, which is that the first music Stravinsky wrote for this opera is the prelude to the graveyard scene in the last act.
Really? Yeah.
And the thing that I find fascinating about this is that this little prelude, which lasts maybe a minute, sounds a lot more like the other music Stravinsky was writing in the 1950s. It's much more astringent, it's much more dissonant. Um, he clearly thought that he was going to be writing in that idiom. He wrote this, I should say, he wrote this prelude before he got the libretto. So he literally hadn't seen the words yet. And then he got the libretto, and it seems to me that he thought, oh, I have to do something totally different. So this is all just to say, you got to be reactive and you got to be able to embrace a wide variety of styles of gestures. Yeah.
Yeah. And I love, we have a question from the audience. Gail is asking, where is Tom progressing to? Which I love. And I would remind everybody, feel free to put questions in the Q&A box or in the chat.
Well, I don't know what you would say to that, Taylor, but I would say he's progressing to nowhere good. I think this is progress, not in the sense of, historical progress or being a progressive, but progress just in the sense of a certain kind of development. The piece is based on a series of pictures by William Hogarth that sort of show a descent, in a way, a descent into debauchery and self-deception. So you could say, I mean, Auden was very strict about certain moral things. He was a really moralizing poet. He said something that really haunts me. It was not about the Rake's progress. It was something else. But he basically said, let's see if I can remember it. The gates of hell stand wide open. And what he meant by that was, if you're in hell, you're actually welcome to leave whenever you want. But the inhabitants of hell can't, because they've convinced themselves that they need to be there. That the path of self-deception, and I think that really applies to the Rake's progress, in that it's this accumulation of guilt and the feeling of, well, no, I've already made that decision, so I can't go back to my girlfriend now because, like, she would despise me because I did X thing. And so it just becomes this, he ties the noose tighter and tighter. So what do you think, Taylor?
Yeah, I struggle with how to verbalize the meaning of progress in this sense. It's more of it's an interesting source material for an opera. Oh dear. I hope I am still there. Yes, I am still there. Just thinking of it, most operas come from plays a lot of times, or other narrative material that has a more through sense of through line than these pictures. And I love how this work does, you do get these tableaus if you think of it in relation to the pictures. You do get scenes that are very clearly, this is the moment where this happens, this is the moment where this happens. And so I think of the progress being more the way you progress through an art gallery almost. That is the way, and we as the audience are making this progression, watching this person's descent, really, from a bucolic life with love and people around to having people around that are not connected to you, and being alone in a crowd at the end in Bedlam. But that was a little bit of a wandering response, but that's one way that I think of the progress being in this.
Another thing that I find fascinating is we know from the early letters between Stravinsky and Auden that they planned for it to be much more of a series of tableaus early
Mm,
on. Stravinsky was attracted to this figure of the fiddler. There's a fiddler in some of the Hogarth pictures, and I think that for him connected back to his piece, The Soldier's Tale, where the devil, the devil went down to Georgia. There's a devil with a violin, and I think he was planning on something that was a little bit more acerbic and satirical. And
mm,
then I think the emotion of this piece caught them all by surprise. It
yeah.
ended up being way more human.
Mm, hmm. That's very interesting. You talked a little bit about the difference between this and other pieces that Stravinsky is writing in the same period.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know if I have my dates exactly right, but this is kind of when Stravinsky is moving towards 12-tone music and atonality.
Mhm.
I think, I mean, this is obviously conjecture. We can never get inside of his head. Do you think the completion of this piece in some ways rounded out that period of neoclassicism? Is it kind of a button or a bookend on that he then, is it a period in the sentence that then he starts a new paragraph? How do you think of it relating to his output?
I think that is so right. I think this is a period on this period. Like it's a very big button on
Hmm,
on on his. It's so. I mean, it really is as full as one of the great Mozart operas. I do think it was like, what more could he have to say in this idiom?
hmm,
And I think absent this piece, he was already in a different place with some of the other pieces he was writing. But because of the nature of this material and this drama, he had to do it. I think also, I could be proven wrong, but when Stravinsky writes 12 tone atonal music, the pieces tend to be really short. They tend to
hmm.
be like, I think of them as like spiders or some kind of very spindly creature that just, they don't really need our love. They're like, I'm fine. I'm gonna just like stop over here. And in a way, they're brilliant. They're these kind of amazing machines, but they tend to evanesce very quickly. I don't think it really would have been possible for Stravinsky to write a 2 hour long opera in that 12 tone mode. I think he needed something that was a little bit richer and more, um, inviting.
Yeah.